We're live.
Yay!
Hello, everybody.
And in case you're wondering, we did just count down from 10. Like this was a rocket ship to do it right on time. Welcome to our second GraphQL meetup. I'm Alex Banks. You can find me at Moon Tahoe. This is Eve Porcello. You can find her at Eve Porcello. And we are still coming to you from the indoors. So we are still under quarantine. And the one silver lining of this quarantine is that it's brought the fro back. I didn't ever think I was going to have the fro again, and I got it, and I'm digging it, so that's good. There we go. So yay, welcome to the second GraphQL meetup. This meetup is brought to you in collaboration with this.labs. And if you don't know who we are, we're Moon Highway. So we're located in Tahoe City, and we build training materials for software engineers. We have classes on LinkedIn Learning. We have classes on Egghead.io. And we also write books. So we wrote these 2 books for O'Reilly, and we're also in the process of bringing you a second edition of Learning React, which is really completely different than the first edition because of hooks mostly. Anyway, today Eve's going to be talking to you guys about server mocking. So you're going to be talking about the Apollo server and server mocking?
Correct, yes.
And I'm going to be hanging out in the back in another room and just answering any questions that you guys might have on the chat. So without further ado, I also want to mention this, that our next meetup, the third GraphQL meetup is happening on June 2nd. And I talked at the last one. Eve is talking at this one. And we're hoping that you're going to be talking at the next one. So if you have any great talk ideas, send us an email at hey@moonhighway.com. This is a great place to get started with your first GraphQL talk, your first technology talk. So don't be shy. If we want to learn what you've been learning too. So even if you've struggled on something and you overcame that struggle with some technique or some library or something that you learned about, we really want to hear about it. So don't be shy. Send us an email, hey@moonhighway.com. And that's about all for me.
Cool.
I'll be on the chat if you have questions.
Yeah, so speaking of the chat, where's everybody joining us from? You can use that chat feature to drop where you're from. I'm from Tahoe City. Alex is clearing out of here very gracefully with our giant chair. So that's going great. I wish I pulled back the entire curtain on that. All right. So cool. Well, we're going to just jump into the content then without any further ado. I want to make this kind of a workshop style presentation today. So if you'd like to follow along with anything I'm doing, you can follow along here at github.com/GraphQL workshop/mocking. And I'm going to drop that in the chat as well. So that is going to be our starter repo for all things that we're going to talk about today. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Now, if we go to this repo, let me pull it up here actually. So if you go to this repo, I want to take you on a tiny tour of what you can find here. The first thing is the main branch for this repository. All the instructions for setting this up are here. And these are the starter files. So if you just want to start out where I'm going to be starting out, which is where we have a very simple Apollo server setup, you can. Or if you want to jump ahead and look at the complete branch, that is where I'm going to end up today. So 2 different options. If you just want to look at the finished code, you can always find it there, particularly if you get stuck along the way. All right, so I have this project already downloaded in VS Code. I'm also going to start it. So once you have it downloaded, you can npm install those dependencies or yarn them if you prefer yarn. And then we're going to run npm start. Now, when I run npm start, it looks like we have a server running on localhost 4000. So if I go to localhost 4000, and I'll do so over here, and I always should have this just running and up. This is our GraphQL playground. So this is an Apollo server configuration that has been set up so that we can get started with some simple mocking. So let's look at what is inside of this folder. So the first thing that's in this folder is an index file. The index file contains our Apollo server configuration here on line 1. And in order to make an Apollo server work, we have two different things. So we have the schema. So a GraphQL schema defines all of the different types that are available on your API. So inside of this string here, we're going to create some types so that we can query this data. We also have resolvers. So the two things that an Apollo server needs, number one is the schema, and number two is resolvers. So resolvers are just functions, and these functions are going to return data for the schema. So if I query hello, we should see hello world returned. Now, we can test this out along the way by going back over to localhost 4000, and we can take a look at the, let's see. So we can take a look at the query here. And the query I'm going to send is just for hello. This should return hello world. So if you're brand new to GraphQL, this is the place that we can get started. We can understand how to create a schema and to bring back some data for those fields in that schema. Okay, so then on line 15 here, we're setting up our server. We pass in the type definitions and the resolvers to that new Apollo server constructor. So what we've done with these resolvers so far is we have said, all right, every time I ask for that hello field, I want to return some data. In this case, it's just a string. It matches our string for this query. But what happens if I don't have any data yet? Maybe the database isn't set up, or maybe I can't connect to that REST API because another team owns it and we don't have access to it. Well, what we can do with Apollo Server is really not waste any time. We can get started simply by using mocks. So instead of using these resolvers, I'm going to get rid of them. I'll delete them for now. We're going to replace the resolvers with mocks. And I'm just going to, for now, say mocks true. So this is some mock data. It's some fake data that we're going to set up for our schema. So if I have a query that returns a string for hello, it should reason that if I query this data, it's going to return some sort of string. So right now it's returning hello world. That's the default string. That's the default mock that's being returned. If I change the return here to a different type, let's say an int, and I go back and I query the same data, what this should return is an int. It's returning just some number for this field. So this is where the mocking stuff with Apollo Server starts to get really cool. We have, with our GraphQL schema, a type system for our API, some types that are part of our API. And then because those types are so predictable, we can use mocks to return data for those fields. All right, so let's go ahead and add on to our schema a little bit. At this point, we want to create a type. So let's go ahead and create one of my favorite types, a cat. And the cat type is an object type that will have a few different fields available. So we'll say ID should return an ID. We'll say name should return a string. And then we will have age that returns an int, and then nice, which returns a boolean. Okay. So far we've created this custom object type. It has a few different fields available on it. Now, I saw a message in the chat just pop up from Conrad. Hi, Conrad, by the way. I know Conrad well. And he says, is this chat open? Yeah, totally. So use the YouTube chat if you want. Alex will be manning any questions, but I'll be looking at it too to make sure that we get all of those questions answered. All right, so we've created our cat. Now what we want to do is we want to create a query for this cat. So what I'm going to add here is a query called all cats. And this should return a list of cat objects. Now, when I go back over to the playground, I can send my query for all cats. Guess what's going to be available on that? An ID, a name, an age, and whether or not the cat is nice. So now when I click play on this, it's going to return that mock data. So the mock data that's being returned here, ID, name, age, and nice, all of this is just fake data that's being returned. But if I don't have my data ready that I want to use, or if I'm building a prototype for something, this makes setting up our servers really easy. All right. So what I want to do is this. I'm going to go back to our type definitions, and I see a question that's popping up here. So I'm going to answer this out loud for everybody, even though I'm sure Alex will answer that in the chat as well. Why do we have these exclamation marks after these types? What is this all about? Well, this just means that those fields are non-nullable. It means that if I ask for ID, name, age, or nice, it has to return something. So yeah, it's required. It is non-nullable. If you remove that, that means that you don't have to return anything. It's not required. It's nullable. Okay, awesome questions. I love it. If we go back to our query, though, we see all cats. This is returning our list. We have an ID, name, age, and nice for each one of these. You might notice that this is only returning 2 different cats. So the default with Apollo server is that if we're using mocks, it's always going to return if we're asking for a list, as we're doing on line 11 here. It's always going to return 2 objects. So we're going to customize this a little later in order to make this a different number if we want it to be. But for now, we should just understand that if you add a list to your query type, it's going to return 2 objects in that list. Okay. So like I said, we're returning some defaults here. We have these IDs being generated. Hello world is the value that's returned for a string. We have some sort of number being returned for an int. And then we have a true or false for this nice field. Now, what happens if I want to add some custom values for these different types of fields? Well, we can definitely do that. So what we'll do is we're going to create another object here on line 15. Now, this new object is going to be called mocks. And inside of this mocks object, what I want to do is I want to, every time I query this ID field, I want to return something specific. So I want to overwrite the default value. So I'm going to say ID should return, let's say 32. So every ID will be 32. This is not a great idea, but it's going to return 32 and overwrite the default. The next thing I'll do is I'll say, let's return for all of our ints. We want to return 6. Now, again, by type, if I ask for a string, as I do on line 6 for the cat, we want to return a string that is custom. Biscuit. This is our nice biscuit cat. And then finally, we'll add boolean, should return in each case true. Okay, cool. So now instead of using mocks true to provide all of those defaults for us, we instead are going to use these custom mocks that I've created. So let's see what our playground is looking like. I'm going to hit play again. Let's see what I'm doing wrong. There we go. So it's refreshed now. We see that every time I'm asking for an ID, it's going to return 32. Every time I ask for a string, it's going to return biscuit. Every time I ask for an age, it'll be 6. And every time I ask for a boolean, it's going to be true. So this is how we overwrite those mocks sort of broadly, we can say all IDs should be a certain string, all ints should be a certain number, all strings should be a certain string, and all booleans should be true. Okay, so far so good. We've created some custom mocks for our cat, but at this point we might be thinking, do we really want to have every cat be 6 and have them all have the same names and stuff like that? We can probably make this a little better by incorporating another library. So in the files for this project, we have also installed a helpful utility called Faker. Faker is an NPM package that allows you to generate some fake data. So you don't have to use Faker. You can use Casual or any other sort of generator library that you'd like to. But we're going to use Faker to customize these mocks even further. So we're going to go ahead and use const Faker, and then we'll require the Faker library. And now we want to make some adjustments to our mocks. So I want to keep this all on one screen for now. Let's collapse that a little bit. So instead of returning 32 every time for this ID, what we want to do is we want to say faker.random.uuid. So where are all of these functions coming from? They're just coming from the Faker library. So if you wanted to check out all of the options, let's find Faker on NPM just for good measure. So you can check out the documentation for this package, and it's going to go through all of the different options. Let me pull up the GitHub and share that. So this is going to give you information about all of those different functions, and there are a ton of these. So I'm going to go ahead and post that for you all. That README file should give you everything you really need to get started. Okay, so now let's go back to our code. We have created this random UUID. Now, this is going to look pretty similar to what we had before, right? It's a random UUID, an ID that you can use to associate with each individual cat. Let's make this a little more fun though. So on the int, let's go ahead and use this function faker.random.number. And this number function takes in an object where you can supply a minimum and a maximum. So I'm going to say min is 1. Then I'll say max is 100, because all pets live to be 100. So if we go back to our code, we see that there is a random number generated between 1 and 100. This is different than the built-in mock that was part of Apollo server, where we had a lot of negative numbers and things like that. This is going to allow us to really dial in the specifics about what we want those numbers to be. Okay. Next up, let's go ahead and use a fun one of these Faker functions, faker.name.firstname. And this is just going to generate a random first name. So now I have these different names for the cats that are being supplied. I always think these are really funny. There's one called Alexander. Alex, there's a cat named after you. But these are just random first names, so you can create some more interesting data. Think about when you're prototyping something. This is going to make your prototypes look even more realistic. And then finally, let's go ahead and generate a fake Boolean. So I'll say faker.random.boolean. And then again, this will just be true or false. So each time I send that query, it will return either true or false for that nice value. All right. So far, so good. I see some great questions popping up in the chat. Alex is answering a lot of those there, but keep them coming. You can definitely ask questions about anything that we've covered so far. Okay, So we've reached the point in our application's life where we want to add another type. So we have cats. Let's go ahead and add a type called horse. Horses are going to have a few specific fields on them. First is an ID. The second is a name, which will be a string. The third is going to be an age. So we'll add int here. And then finally, we'll add a description. So the description will be a string. So again, we're using this GraphQL schema definition language to describe all of the different types that are available on this API. In this case, we have a cat, we have a horse, and then in the query type, we can define any specific queries that we want to be able to use to access that data. So let me go ahead and add horse, and that should return a list of horse objects. Okay, so let's see what we get if we query the all horses query. So I'm going to replace all cats with all horses. Now, inside of all horses, we'll return name, ID, age, and description. Okay, cool. So far, we have an ID that's being generated. That makes sense, a custom UUID for each one of these. We have a first name being generated for the name. That's good. Age is asking for an int, so this is returning some sort of number between 1 and 100. Now, in this case, we have another field here on the horse called description. Description returns a string, but in this case, our horse description is returning a name. And why is that? Because we told it to. We said, always return a first name when you query a string. So we can actually overwrite this specifically for the horse so that we can have a field for our horse description. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to add horse to the top here. And horse, again, we'll use a function to return something. So in this case, we'll return an object. And what we're going to do here is anytime I ask for the description field on a horse, we want to call another function right here that's going to return a custom description for this field. So again, every time I ask for this field, I want to build into my server mock some sort of a function that will return some custom data for me. So let's go ahead and return something, a majestic creature. So what we'll do is try to query that again. And once again, it's going to return a majestic creature for this description. But we can take this even a step further. So we're going to use a combination of Faker and our GraphQL or Apollo server mocks to make this work. So let's go ahead and say const horse descriptions. Now, this horse descriptions list is going to be a list of possible options that could describe a horse. So we'll say majestic, we'll say honorable, and we'll say street smart. All the most common descriptions of horses. Then what we'll do, instead of returning just a regular old string, is we're going to return this faker function. So we'll say faker.array element. And what we'll do here is we'll just pass in this array of horse descriptions. So you could literally pass in an array, or we'll just reference the horse descriptions array here. Okay. So at this point, if we go back to our, let's see, faker.random.array element. That's better. So it's going to return a random array element for that. Cool. So now each of our horses has the appropriate description. majestic, street smart, and those are going to be random each time I click play. Okay. So again, we're able to create these custom mocks using Apollo Server. And this allows us to create prototypes, to get working, to really decide if our schema is what we want it to be before we go to the extent of connecting all of our data sources using those resolver functions that I talked about earlier. Okay. So what else can we do to make this even better? I think the next thing I want to do is pull in another feature of Apollo Server to deal with this thing that's happening. I almost called it a problem. It's not really a problem, but every time we return a list of items, it returns two objects, two items. So if you want to customize that, let's say your prototype, your UI has 6 little boxes for horses to go in, you could customize the number of responses for this query. So for all horses or all cats. Step 1 is we'll pull in the mock list. So mock list is this tool that we can use to customize the number of items that should be in each one of these lists. Once we incorporate this, I'm going to scroll down to our custom mocks, and I'm going to add a query here. So our query should actually be a function. And this query function is going to be called every time I query the all cats query. Let's take a look at it. We're going to say all cats. And then for this one, we'll say that this should return a new mock list. And let's say 6 for now. We're going to pass in 6 for this query. Back to our playground. We can then add an all cats query. And we'll add ID, name, and age, and whether or not they're nice. Let's get all those fields in the mix. So now when I send that query, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm feeling good about this. 5, 6. So every time it's going to return that number. You also can pass an array of options to the mock list. So I should say you can pass an array that defines a range for this. So I could say, I want to see between 1 and 20. Every time I send that all cats query, I want to see between 1 and 20. So let's try it again. This time we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7. Cool. And then if I send that same query again, we see 2. That one was nice to me. It didn't give me too many to work with, but it's going to give you some sort of number between 1 and 20, which can be useful. Okay. So back to our mocks, we've created custom mocks for a few different scalar values. So what I mean by scalar values is just if a field returns a single value, like a string or like an int or like an ID, we're going to use these functions to populate some data for that. We also want to understand, though, that sometimes we have some data already, some data that we want to use for specific fields, but we want to mock the rest of the schema. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another value called resolvers. And this time we're going to create a query resolver. And again, a resolver is just a function that returns data for a particular field. So what I'm saying here is every time I send a query for all cats, I want to return just this data here. So my data is ID 1, name, meatball. I'm trying to overwrite some data here. Let me show you how this looks. First, we're going to pass resolvers into the Apollo server constructor. So let's go back to our query. This time we'll send that same query for all cats, but we're still getting the same data. We're still getting the same mocked data. So we have Wendy and Isabel and some other cats that are being supplied. Now, the thing I missed here is we need to pass in one other configuration value or option to this server constructor, and it's called mock entire schema false. So without this line 56 here, without this little configuration option added in, the mocks are going to override here. And it's just going to fully override any resolvers. But really what I want to say is if there are some resolvers, like I've written on 46, use those. And then any other fields that aren't covered by those resolvers, mock those. So we'll go back over to our query. And now if I send this query for all cats, a couple interesting things are going on here. So thing one is it's returning just a single array. It's also returning the ID 1 and the name meatball. But in my resolver, I didn't say anything about any of those extra fields. So when I ask for age and nice, it's going to mock those fields for me. So this is cool stuff. So yeah, mocks are built into Apollo server. And the real power of Apollo server, the real power of GraphQL starts to show itself when we think about GraphQL as a type system for our API. And because we have this type system, because we're clearly stating everything that is available on this API, it's fairly straightforward to mock the fields because we always know what to expect for each one of those fields. So this stuff is pretty cool. I get really excited about mocks. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So let me pull up our repo real quick. If you joined us late or if you wanted to follow along, I'm going to pull up our link one more time. Of course, I closed this. All right, cool. So you can find all of this code. The starter repo is at GraphQL workshop/mocking. And I'll drop that in the chat right now under the this.media handle. But if you want to take a look at how the complete version looks, you can always use the dropdown and go to the complete branch. And then I can go ahead and copy and paste that into the chat as well. So that will be a fully complete version of that. Okay. Cool. So the next thing I want to do, now that we kind of understand how the server is working with mocks, I want to take a look at some other mocking capabilities that we have on the client. So let's look first at our GraphQL playground. The GraphQL playground that we have running here on localhost 4000, as we've seen, is doing a couple of things for us. It is creating a schema. And if you haven't taken a look at the GraphQL playground before, you always can open up the docs panel on the right-hand side of the screen to take a look at all of the fields that are currently available as part of this GraphQL API. So we understand how to add mocks on the server. And those server mocks are going to be really useful when prototyping or starting to plan our applications. But what happens if you are a front-end developer? You're a front-end developer or you're someone who is consuming the data from a GraphQL API, and maybe you wanted to add some extra fields to that API. Well, what's really cool about Apollo Client, so the tool that we use for building client applications, is we can use mocks on the client side as well. I know, it's so exciting. I agree. I'm going to assume that everyone is just cheering right now because they're so excited. So what I've done here is I have a client application that is currently trying to consume some data from this API here. So this API is the Snowtooth API. I think we might have taken a look at this last time we had a meetup together, very briefly. But the Snowtooth API is a real GraphQL API for a fake ski resort. So some of the types that you'll see at this API are lifts, so those chair lifts that take you to the top of the mountain, and trails. So that's the way that you get down the mountain. You ski down on a trail. The documentation panel here shows us everything that's available on this API. But the people who created this API, I'm not able to talk to. And I'm a front-end developer and I need to make some extra fields. I need to add some extra fields to this lift type in order to get my prototype done. So what I can do here is I can create mocks on the client side. So I have created this using Code Sandbox. And I have a nice white screen of death. Hold on. Okay, cool. I know why. So this Code Sandbox, I want to show you what is going on here. So a couple things. This is an example of an Apollo client setup. So here we have our Apollo client. We're passing in a couple of options here. We have a link and we have a cache. The link, if we scroll up a little further, is right here. This is our connection to our GraphQL API. Remember that GraphQL API that was on snowtooth.moonhighway.com? This is that link. We're creating that connection between our client application and that GraphQL API. Now, the second thing here is the cache. So the cache we're using here, the in-memory cache, is Apollo's way of creating a local store for that data that you ask for from this GraphQL API. So the client always has a link and it always has a cache. That's typically how it works every time we set up an Apollo client. And then what we're using here on line 44 is client.query. So we're sending a query directly to this API. So let's take a look at what this client looks like. It looks like this, all lifts, ID, name, and status. That looks a whole lot like what we saw on the playground a second ago. But then we're logging that value to the console. So if we look at our data, all the lifts that are coming back have ID, name, and status. But here's where the client-side mocking comes into play. What we've done here on line 7 is we've created our own type definitions for some fields that don't exist on the API. They don't exist on Snowtooth's GraphQL API, but I, as a client-side developer, need them to exist so I can display some fake data for my prototype. So what I'm saying is I want a field called wait time, and I want a field called capacity. So each of these should be available every time I try to query them. And then what we've done here for the client side is we've said, all right, let's even take this a step further. This looks really familiar, right? Our wait time, every time we ask for that wait time field, we want to generate a random number between 5 and 100. Hopefully you're not ever waiting for 100 minutes for a chairlift, but anything is possible. I think I have actually. So let's go ahead and adjust our query here on line 26. and we're going to ask for wait time. Now, as soon as I do that, and as soon as I click save, we see some problems. Oh, so it says the response is not successful. And usually that network error means that there's something wrong with our query. The thing that's wrong with our query is fairly quick to fix. We just need to add the @client directive. What the @client directive says is this is a field that I've created only on the client side. This is a custom field that doesn't currently exist on the server, but I want to be able to query it from the client. So now if I take a look at this and I look at the object that's being loaded, again, we see all of our lifts. So our array of lifts is coming back, but this time we have another field here. So the wait time is present on each one of these objects, and it's a number between 5 and 100. Cool. So just to recap, a couple things going on here. First things first, if you haven't seen the Apollo client before, Apollo client has the link, which establishes our connection to a GraphQL data source. We have the cache, which is going to store our data locally. And then what we've done here is we have added a schema, a client-side schema, and resolvers on this Apollo client configuration. So then what we do is we use the extend type syntax. And extend type is just going to say, hey, I want these fields to be available on the client side. And then what we've also done is we've created a custom resolver. And this custom resolver is going to return some sort of number between 5 and 100. So I'm going to share this in the chat as well, this client mocking sample. I'm not thrilled about this little pop-up that's appearing here. Let me hit save on that. There we go. Cool. So once that comes back around, this will be accessible to everybody with those changes that I just made. All right, cool. So that's a little taste of server-side mocking and a taste of client-side mocking. There's a lot of different options that you have available to you. But if you take one thing away from our time together today, I just want you to know that we often associate GraphQL with just sending queries to get some data. GraphQL, QL is in the name, so that makes sense that we would associate it with that. But there's also the power that we get from the schema. The schema definition language that is part of GraphQL allows for several great benefits. Number one, we can pull everybody into the same room together, and the schema becomes this means of communication across all of our different teams. So we don't have to worry about meeting with other folks on our teams as much. We can just come together in a room, decide on in a Zoom room, probably at this time, come together and decide on what are the types that are available on our API. Then we can build prototypes using mocking. And then we can worry about the resolvers. We can worry about those functions that go get the data for our schema to work. We can worry about that stuff later. And we can really get started on a positive note by just testing all of this stuff out using mocks. Yes, GraphQL doesn't stand for Graph Queen Latifah, even though Alex and I wish it did, as he mentions in the chat. It does stand for query language, but that's okay. All right, cool. So you can find all of those links. I've shared those with everybody in the chat. We are officially done with the content for today's course, but of course we'll hang out as long as you'd like to answer any questions that come up. I want to remind everybody that you can join our, let's pull our slides up for a second. I want to remind everybody that you can sign up to speak at the next meetup if you'd like to. This is a very low stress meetup. you can talk about literally anything GraphQL related that you want to. And if there's any way we can support you as a new speaker, if you are a new speaker, we'd love to, because new speakers are awesome. The way that Alex and I started speaking at conferences is we spoke at meetups first. And so hopefully you will follow suit. All right. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here today. Let me officially put some links on the screen so that we are doing all the right things. So again, this is where you can find those resources. You can also peek in GraphQL Workshop in general. There's a lot of good teaching resources there. Follow Moon, Tahoe, and Eve Porcello on Twitter if you'd like to. And if you want to join our mailing list, we do a lot of giveaways and stuff like that. But if you don't want to join our mailing list, this is not a pressure. This is not something we want to pressure you about. But cool. Thank you all so much for being here. Again, my name is Eve Porcello. Alex is here as well. And we thank you so much for spending some time with us today.